As we begin our unit on magical realism, the first short story that we will read is A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So we're going to learn a little bit more about him today. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was born in 1928, although some people say in 1927, in Arqueteca, a small town near the Caribbean coast of Colombia. Let's look at the history of Colombia. In the 1800s, the country nearly always was in a state of civil war. The unrest between the two regional groups, so the two groups that influenced the Civil War, were the coast, or the liberals, and the mountains, which was the conservatives. Colombia was a Spanish colony until 1810. In 1815, General Murillo reconquers the country. In 1820, reliberated by Simon Bolivar, who became Colombia's first president. In 1849 was the beginning of a feud between two political factions, the liberals and the conservatives. Imperialism was an issue in Colombia. There was an American-run United Fruit Company, which came to Colombia and Arqueteca in 1910. So imperialism is when a country comes in and not necessarily conquers the country itself, but influences the economy by bringing businesses in and influencing the culture and the economy and the government. In 1928, there was an event called the Banana Strike Massacre. An American United Fruit Company took economic control and exploited the Colombian people. The conservative government killed unarmed workers holding the demonstration. It was denied by the government and removed from history books. So, the early life of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Again, he was born in 1928. His parents were very poor and they had 12 children. Gabriel, or Gabito or Gabo, was the oldest child. He lived with his mother's parents until the age of 8. His grandparents were against the marriage of his parents for political and military reasons. He was greatly influenced by his grandparents, and he began writing stories as a child. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was very close with his grandfather, who had a military career, and he led Arqueteca to become a liberal town. His grandfather was a storyteller and the closest bond that Gabriel had. His grandfather is represented in some of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's characters, and he told Gabriel that there's no greater burden than to kill a man. His grandmother was also a storyteller, very superstitious. She blurred lines between living and dead, which can be seen in magical realism. At age 8, he moved back with parents to Riverport of Sucre, which is town in Chronicle is modeled after Sucre. So Chronicle is a story or a novel that he wrote. He attended boarding school. During young adulthood, he went to Jesuit College and began to read law. One of his professors would later become president of Colombia. He was classmates with Camilo Torres, active in a guerrilla movement later in life. He dropped out of law school in 1950. In 1954, he was sent to Rome on an assignment for his newspaper, and since then he had mostly lived abroad in Paris, New York, Barcelona, and Mexico, in a more or less compulsory exile. Let's look at the history of Colombia. La Violencia was an event in which 150,000 Colombians were killed by the year 1953. Liberal George Gaetan investigated the Banana Massacre. In 1946, conservatives terrorized liberal voters, murdering them. In 1947, Gaetan became a party leader, and in 1948 he was assassinated. There were 3 days of deadly riots. Guerrilla soldiers killed 2,500 Colombians, and peasants fled to Venezuela. So, as you can see, Colombia has had a lot of political unrest. World events. In 1949, tyrant ruler Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba, and Fidel Castro took power. In 1957, Colombian dictatorship was in full force. Curfews, news blackouts, dictator fled. In 1959 through 1961 was the Cuban Revolution. His middle years. He lived in a brothel. He was friends and taken care of by prostitutes. He portrays prostitutes favorably in his novels. He lived in and worked in many countries, which include France, Cuba, Mexico, England, and the United States. He was married. He married in 1958 to Mercedes Barcia, his childhood sweetheart, known as the sacred crocodile due to Egyptian origin. He first proposed when he was only 13. After the Cuban Revolution, he returned to Central America. He worked as a journalist and a screenwriter. His first newspaper jobs, he wrote about various topics, which include astrology, twins, the length of women's skirts. As a journalist, he worked for magazines and newspapers, some of which had political overtones. In his later years, a political conflict occurred in 1981. He returned to Colombia only to be accused by the government of funding a guerrilla group. He promptly fled to Mexico. In 1982, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature for his novels and short stories, in which the fantastic and the realistic are combined in a richly composed world of imagination, reflecting a continent's life and conflicts. In 1999, he was diagnosed with lymphatic cancer and went into remission. In 2012, his brother announced that Gabriel suffered from dementia. He died of pneumonia at the age of 87 on April 17, 2014, in Mexico City. The Colombian president said that 100 years of solitude and sadness for the death of the greatest Colombian of all time, talking about Gabriel. The former Colombian president said, Master Garcia Marquez, thanks forever. Millions of people on the planet fell in love with our nation, fascinated with your lines. And in John Green's novel, Looking for Alaska, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is mentioned several times. He said his stories came from an image and not an idea. He published Chronicle of a Death Foretold in 1981, and it's supposedly Fidel Castro helped him edit it. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. He's known for magical realism, and his most famous novels are 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. His major literary influence was Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and then which taught him that narrative didn't have to unfold by a traditional plot. He read works from Faulkner, Hemingway, Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. And then this is a review of magical realism. It was originally used in 1920s by the German art critic Franz Rohe to describe a style of painting. It mixes realism with fantasy, the supernatural and dreamlike elements or references to myths and fairy tales. The setting is normal, not fantasy, and time seems timeless, not chronological. Narrative sounds reliable despite fantasy elements, challenges polar opposites like life and death by linking them. Ordinary events and descriptions occur in magical realism. The inexplicable, which is something that can't be explained, so something like a miracle. It has a strong narrative drive, which contains a message and has fantasy elements that are never explained.